State. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be
safe. All right, welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. Just giving you a quick preview. Today is a bonus episode. So it's not part of our typical line where we do one myth, but part one and part two episodes. This is a bonus one, so we're just going to do one episode on this issue. The myth today being that Flint is an anomaly. This was specifically said by the Secretary of the EPA in Pennsylvania, John Quigley. He specifically said when he was trying to reassure his population in Scranton, Pennsylvania, that Flint is an anomaly because they were worried that they may have a similar problem as Flint. But Flint is not an anomaly. And anyone who says Flint is an anomaly is lying and playing into some false idea of American exceptionalism, which tries to tell people that, you know, America may have a few problems, but overall we're good. And that's just not how this works. So there has been plenty of cases of bad water, poison water throughout the country. There's too many to name for the sake of this episode. But we're talking about whether it's Toledo, Ohio, Jackson, Mississippi. The list goes on. Detroit, Baltimore, the list can go on. Pittsburgh, which is in the state of Pennsylvania. So the list goes on. But today we're going to cover one specific story in Talavast, Florida, based on a story that was written or published in the Boston Review back in February of this year. It's called Poisoning Talavast. And we're going to jump around a little bit in this interview. So I just want to give everybody a quick overview of what happened. And then that way you can fill in the details when you hear the writers discuss it in much more in depth. So there's a city in Talavast, Florida. It's a predominantly Black city. A plant was built in their city in 1957. In 1962, they began processing a substance or a chemical known as beryllium, which goes in missiles. And then from there on, they had to when they would clean up the spot, there was another chemical that they used. Between the beryllium and this chemical that they used to clean up the spot, they left this stuff harvested underneath the ground, and it eventually spreads throughout the ground to the water pipes. And for about 40 to 50 years, people are drinking poisoned water that they did not know about. And then they learn about this about 40 years later. And that's where the fight begins to figure out what's going on. And obviously people had diseases and things of that nature. So that's the story we're discussing. There's much more to it than that. So I'm going to be joined with my co-host Cam, and we're going to get into it. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Yeah, we're here with two guests who wrote a piece called in the Boston Review called "Poisoning Talavast." We're here with Dr. James Manigualt-Bryant and Ruby Babywn. Did I say that correctly? I got it. Yes. All right. So how y'all doing today? If you would like to introduce yourselves.
Yes. Good afternoon. I'm James Manigualt-Bryant. I teach in the Africana Studies Department at Williams College.
Hi, I'm Ruby. I'm a sophomore at Williams, and I'm planning on majoring in environmental studies.
Right, great. And for the record, they are the co-authors of this piece, and they were referred to us by the magnificent Dr. Joy James. And when Dr. Joy James refers something to you, you don't turn that down. That's just how that works. There's very few people who we have that type of respect for, but she is one. So when she says that you should check this out, you don't really question that. So here we are. So the story you covered on Talavast, Florida, is a story about environmental racism. And I know that term and a lot of terms just get floated around nowadays. There's a lot of buzzwords. So what specifically is environmental racism, and what factors shape the spread of environmental racism? Like, how would you define it in a general sense before we get into the specifics of this story? Either one of you.
Sure, I don't mind starting. But before I do, I also want to acknowledge JOSÉ Constantine as a professor of biosciences at Williams, and he was also a co-writer of our essay, Poisoning Talavast. Environmental racism is the excessive placement of facilities, whether waste treatment plants or industrial plants that emit toxins into the air, soil, and groundwater. When facilities like that are placed near or in communities of color, particularly Black communities, we define that as, or I define that as environmental racism. I would add to that, to the extent that that the government, different levels of government, whether local, state, or even the federal government, does not intervene on behalf of communities in cases where corporations place their facilities near communities of color. To the extent that the government does not protect communities, I would also characterize that as a part of environmental racism.
Thank you for that. I think before we dive into the actual larger context of what happened in Talavast, I would love for one of you to just start by humanizing this experience and actually tell us, like, who is the Talavast community, both historically and currently?
Sure, I'll pipe in again. So Talavast is a small Black community right between Manatee and Sarasota counties in Florida, central west Florida. So Manatee County, Bradenton is the main city in Manatee County. Manatee, Sarasota counties are about roughly an hour south of Tampa. Tampa's a little bit more well known.
Right.
And Talavast is a community of just under 80 homes, so just under 80 families that are in between these two municipalities. Talavast was founded at the turn of the 20th century around a turpentine still. A white man from South Carolina, Jeter Talavast, went to the area that now bears his name and founded the turpentine still, and Black laborers from different parts of the state migrated there to work on the turpentine still. So turpentining involves the cutting down of trees and the extraction of resin and sap from trees that is then boiled in a vat and made into turpentine, which is used for sealing things. It was particularly used in the Navy for ships. And so the turpentine still, or rather turpentining lasted for about 20 years in Talavast before the still closed down. And by the time it closed down, all of the trees in the area had essentially been cut down. And after Talavast, the man Talavast, after he left and the still shut down, Black laborers, black folks who used to work at the still, purchased land and established a community and built homes in Talavast.
I think it's really beautiful, just you giving us some full background, and also reminding, like, not just how the town came to be, but like the people within it. You know, this was also a sprawling Black rural community, like any of our communities. You know, thinking about the people who were there with their families, you know, raising them up, going to church. I love how you guys discussed, like, on Fridays and Saturdays, it was nothing to smell barbecues and, you know, community engagement, probably birthday parties, church picnics were probably going on. And just reminding folks of the fact that it wasn't just folks that are just working, but like there was life here, there was love here, there was a community, although small, that completely cared about each other and like wanted the best for one another. And so to see and to read what happened to them is just devastating. And I think it's important for us to not just talk about them, but also to talk about how this connects to so many other Black communities that look just like it across the country.
Yeah, and I think it actually hurts more to read it once the fact that you know there was a community there, right? The fact that you're in your piece that y'all note that makes it hit a little bit more than if it was just racism in this kind of like amorphous general sense. But it's like, no, these were people who were just living their lives, and I don't think the what you had just said in as far as the trees being cut down, I don't think that was in the piece, was it? So yeah, I think that gives it even more of a backdrop, because that was, you could argue that was its own type of environmental racism, as well. So.
Certainly, yes. No, that's true. In fact, I mean, one of the things that we bring out in the essay is how the the industry in Talavast is tied to the military industrial complex. Well, in its initial phases, even the founding of Talavast was sort of based around the military industrial complex, certainly at an earlier stage
Mm-hmm.
of America's military industrial complex, but definitely a part of it. Cam, I appreciate you. I mean, the way that you talk about Talavast makes it seem as though you've been there, but as you said, it's like so many other black communities. I grew up in Bradenton, Florida, so as I mentioned, it's right next to Talavast. My father grew up in Talavast, so he would have been, it's the fourth generation of families of a family to be in Talavast.
Wow.
And so I was the first generation to not grow up in Talavast, although I was there all the time. Just our home was not there.
Right.
I was there all the time. So Talavast at its height, I had a couple of grocery stores, small grocery stores, one of which was owned by my grandparents. Two churches, three churches, a Baptist church, a Methodist church, and a Holiness church. Had and continues to have its own post office, a community center, in addition to, at its height, over 100 homes. And so it was certainly not a metropolis, but it was its own self-operated, self-sustaining community in the midst of the Jim Crow South. And all of the elements that we mentioned in the essay, the characteristics that we mentioned in the essay of picnics, cookouts, just community life, the sense of so much youth and families. Rather, there was this larger sense of family, even though there were families, individual family units in our homes,
right.
but so families took care of other families,
Right.
and just a sense of kinship and a welcoming of outsiders.
Yeah, that's the kind of community you can't even act up in, because everybody know everybody. And so let you be running around doing something you wasn't supposed to do. And Miss Barbara Dream from down the street probably gonna snatch you up, and then you're gonna get it from her. You're probably gonna get it from somebody else once she tells them. And then you gotta get home. And by the time you even got home, 3 phone calls have been made, a couple side eyes have been had, and now the whole block know that you're in trouble. And my grandmother lives in Omaha, Nebraska, and while Omaha itself is pretty huge now, it's also a really small Black community, and so she used to tell me all the stories of how, like, my dad was a troublemaker and how she didn't even have to know what he was doing or where he was at, because she would have got 5 phone calls before he even walked in the door, letting her know what he had been up to. And I think that's so important to just bring in that context of, like, we are community, and to know that, like, this wasn't just research that you wanted to bring to light, but, like, this is your history as well. Like, this was people that you love, that your family loved, and that are important. And it's so important that not just this, and that this story isn't just told as just a singular incident, but to continue to weave that through.
No, that's absolutely right. You know, as you were speaking, I was reminded of just how important education was and is to the community. I mean, at one time it had its own school that went up to 8th grade, and then after 8th grade, for further education, community members would go to schools in in Bradenton.
And that's in the piece you talk about. There was a bus I think everybody had to get on. It was this kind of broken down bus that they had to get on to go to some segregated school far away, and how people were proud that they were still able to make it through that. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So, so that's the part of the story, is that even though Talavast, was located in Manatee County, it was always the last to receive the amenities that other neighborhoods or communities receive, and so it was the last to get streetlights, the last to get sidewalks. In fact, it just got main sidewalks less than 5 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yes, last to get connected to county water, which is where the contamination issue comes in, because homes were on private wells
Right.
that where the source of the water was the groundwater, and that's what actually became contaminated. There are still some homes in Talavast that are on septic tanks, that aren't on the county sewer lines. But the importance of education. So even like without getting these amenities, there's still the sense of kinship and pride in being from Talavast, in being in Talavast, and a main reason for that is because many, if not most, community members own their own homes. They own the land. It was a sense of ownership of the land. It's so important to their sense of pride in Talavast.
That was so intriguing to me to read, and like really made my heart swell before it completely started to break as you continue to read the piece. But I loved how it talked about how even though Talavast was one of the last to receive amenities and lights and power lines, for 2 generations, that y'all had the highest rate of students who were going to college more than other Manatee districts, and how like even the oppression folks faced in that of like having to take a rinky old bread truck to school because they were in school buses, and occasionally being late and being ostracized for that, and yet still showing up and still having pride in each other in the community and actually excelling. And I think that was so important, because sometimes when conversation about the rural communities happen, people assume that there's a lack somewhere. And while this community may not have had everything that it needed, what it lacked in heart, what it lacked in community, what it lacked in brilliance and in pride was just so beautiful to see. So thank you for that.
This question is, so how does the environmental racism begin? Like what's the origins? I know we talked about the trees and things, but what are the origins of this particular poisoning case that you brought up in the piece?
Well, I believe it was 1957 when the original visioneering plant was built in Talavast. And so visioneering was an industrial facility that was not manufacturing beryllium at the time. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure about the history of visioneering in particular. So I can't speak to what exactly they were manufacturing. But I think it was in the early 1960s when this facility was purchased by the American Beryllium Company, and they began to manufacture beryllium products that were then used by the defense industry in order to further the US's military aims. And beryllium is a very strong and lightweight metal, so it's been used in a lot of different components of nuclear missiles. So I believe it was in 1996 when Lockheed Martin then acquired the Loral Corporation, which owned ABC. And so after that point, we just talk about the poisoning of the groundwater and the soil that became apparent in the early 2000s. And so, I mean, like James said, and like I believe that, environmental racism could be the cutting down of the trees in Talavast and the erasure of green space, because environmental amenities are so important to a community. And I think that a lot of Black communities has been systematically deprived of green spaces in which they can live and play and exercise. And so it may have started there, but then certainly when there was a decision made to site this industrial facility in Talavast and expose the community to these harmful toxins that manufacturers knew they were producing. And like James said, I think that the state government is also an important player in this scenario because the state does have say over where these large companies end up locating through the incentives they're able to provide.
Right.
And so a lot of times, the state makes a decision on where they're going to site these facilities, and they often choose to place them in Black communities.
Yeah, I know we did an episode on a local. I mean, most of us are based out of Indianapolis, except for Cameron, who chooses to live in the South. But but we did a show about a situation in Indianapolis, and it wasn't based on any type of environmental effects. But it's interesting how this was just simple, old school displacement. They built a highway right through the hood, just moved everybody out. But they were able to do that because segregation obviously lowers the property value of the homes, and obviously just lowers the value that people see Black people in general, and it just makes it easier to push a highway through that versus a neighborhood that's affluent and white, right? Like that's easy. So in this case, it's similar where we can put a plant by some poor rural Black people, and and who cares what happens, and we don't really have to worry about anything. Like, it makes sense to put it next to them because of the same type of devaluation. I think that's just like a common thread that you see, whether we're talking about just how cities get built, and the different, like Ruby, like you noted, how the government chooses where to put these facilities, and there's certain tax incentives. And then, as you know in this story, initially people thought this would just bring jobs, and everybody's looking for jobs and ways to feed their family, and that makes sense. And you talked about one of the custodians. I'm going to come back to beryllium, but you talked about one of the custodians in the piece where he was just sweeping up the waste that was coming from the plant, and to him it was just dust. And then I believe later on he ends up with cancer, if I'm correct. Years later, and he took that job because it paid more, right? So a lot of this stuff isn't like some mystical, racism. It's real. It's very material in how it plays out, on just how people have practical needs, and then those needs get taken advantage of. And I think this story is a great example of that. So coming back to the beryllium, what are some of the health effects that beryllium has? I know there's also the substance that's used to degrease the tanks and stuff, but what is some of the health effects that beryllium has? Either one of you can answer that question.
So beryllium is the major health threat that it poses is beryliosis, which is when the metal or the dust from beryllium, the beryllium metal attacks the lungs. It's not good to breathe it, to actually breathe the dust. And so it actually attacks and contracts the lungs. And so the laborer you mentioned, Mr. Ziegler, was a custodial worker at ABC. And he, as we mentioned in the article, described his process for disposing of the dust. And as he described it, and as I recorded, and as we describe in the article, he realized that there was no way. He realized that at the time there was no way to completely contain the dust. In fact, when it's dust. I mean, it's in the air. And
Right.
so he asked, after the beryllium was machined, to actually go to each of the machining stations and to put the scraps and the dust, to actually put it in bags, and then to take the bags to another area to empty the bags and then to wash them.
So that dust is going to be all over the place.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. And he also it was also attached to his clothes, and so he would then take that home with him, and so his wife, Mrs. Ziegler, and her brother, Mr. Mazon, they also contracted borreliosis, and Mr. Ziegler passed away, but his wife, his widow, and brother-in-law are still alive, but still have beryllium. It's not something that can be cured.
Okay, so it was borreliosis, not cancer. I just want to correct myself on that.
Well, I actually believe it's a kind of cancer.
Okay.
I may be wrong there, but I believe it's actually a kind of.
Okay.
It's a form.
Okay. Yeah, I just didn't want to say that the wrong way. So I know you kind of spoke about the timeline, but we wanted to kind of track it just so we could hit certain details. So I know, like you said, originally people started working there, and this beryllium has been in the area, but then there's this other substance that I brought up earlier. Can you expand on that? The substance that's actually used to clean the tanks, and then what happens to that substance? Because if I'm correct, the city claims that substance was being shipped out, and it wasn't. Is that right?
Yes, I will do my best to explain this part of the process, but I believe the chemical you're referring to is trichloroethylene, or TCE. And so the ABC facility used TCE to degrease the machinery that they use to process beryllium. And so TCE is a highly toxic chemical that's a probable or known human carcinogen. And so they had to, I guess, use the TCE in order to remove compounds from their machinery so that they could continue to use it. And so there was an elaborate sort of system that ABC used in order to dispose of or store TCE and other organic solvents that they used to clean their equipment. And so in reports that were filed with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the facility claimed that they would put TCE in drums that would then be shipped off-site to a place that has been designated as somewhere where hazardous waste can be stored. But I believe,
probably another side of environmental racism. Yeah.
Yes. And then, so I believe at some point it became apparent that all of these drums of TCE were not actually being shipped off-site. There were many of them that remained on the ABC facility right in the middle of Talavast. And so at some point, TCE began leaking out of the places in which it was stored. It was also stored in these subsurface concrete containers that are thought to be the primary source of the leak of TCE. And so we're not quite sure when exactly TCE began to leak into the groundwater below Talavast, but from calculations that JOSÉ performed, it seems like TCE began leaking almost from the start of when ABC began operating in Talavast. And so from there, this TCE and some other solvents as well leaked into the groundwater and also the soil of the community.
Another thing that I also was blown away by when not only listening to you speak, but reading the piece was that, it wasn't just the ABC that was reporting that everything was fine and dandy, but also like the Florida Department of Environmental Protection itself was just clearing these inspections, and that for me wasn't something that I didn't know happens in general, but also it's just crazy because so often it's easy when we read propaganda in the news, it's like, oh yeah, these companies were lying, blah, blah, blah. But like, no, the actual Federal Department of Environmental Protection was not protecting anyone except these assets because they were aware of things that were happening. You don't just walk around and not see giant vats that are labeled toxic waste and just say, oh, I had no clue. It's not like it's an office trash can. Like these are huge. I literally had to go Google it because I was like, no. My brain instantly went to like thinking of things that I've seen in movies where they're huge. And I was like, no, it's exactly what I had saw. They are actually large, like larger than wine barrels. And so to me, that was crazy. What was the impact of this on the community? Like all of this is happening, they're seeing all these reports are coming out. Was anyone in the community made aware? Were there talks about this? Were there resources that were then poured into the community to help protect them at all?
And also, what were the health effects of TCE? Just in concert with what she just asked.
Right. The potential health effects of TCE, various forms of cancer. We list the different kinds.
I'm gonna actually read it if you don't mind.
Yeah,
You got TCE is linked to a variety of psychological disorders and significantly higher risk of kidney cancer, liver cancer, Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, cervical cancer, and prostate cancer. In 1977, the federal government listed TCE as a priority pollutant in the Clean Water Act, and in 1982, the Environmental Protection Agency identified TCE as a serious threat to drinking water, establishing a maximum allowable concentration of 5 micrograms per liter for drinking water. So just to give people like this is not something nobody knew. Like Cameron was saying, like this is an obvious like cancer in many senses, right? So yeah.
I'm like, it said since 1915 there were reports of this, but it wasn't even until larger studies in the 50s saw like the huge major effects and even started making this known, which was absolutely insane. And not even just thinking, I think so often people, when these conversations are happening, it's just about the physiological impacts. We talk about cancer, we talk about pneumonia, we talk about liver issues, but it also talked about like psychological disorders were coming out of this. And that's not even before we even get into the community impact and the psychological toll that takes on a community to have to watch so many people get sick, to have to bury loved ones, to care for them, the impact on your finances if your sole breadwinner cannot work anymore and now you are sacrificing. So like not only does this impact individual lives, but going back to the community as a whole, like this is damaging them on generational levels.
No, that's absolutely right. And what, from my perspective, what makes it even more egregious is this continued denial of the impact. Mm-hmm. The continued denial by various Florida state agencies, whether it's Department of Health or whether it's Florida Department of Environmental Protection. In addition to to Lockheed, and we can't even blame the original culprit of ABC because ABC no longer exists. Right. And so it's this ongoing just denial of what happened, and then for Lockheed to then step in and to assume responsibility for the cleanup, but the attitude behind it continues to be like, well, you should be grateful that we're doing anything because it's not even our fault, right? Even though Lockheed bought Laurel Corporation, which they had already been in business with before Lockheed purchased them. It's not like they just came out the blue and said, we're going to purchase Loral and everything that Loral Corporation possesses, including ABC. They were in business all along, and this is part of a pattern that Lockheed has. In fact, if they list all of the sites that they are remediating now on their own website, and a number of them have a similar profile of Talavast. Lockheed being this multi-billion-dollar corporation, defense contractor, and it purchases a site and for one purpose, and then it calculates that, okay, these other sites that are associated with it, we're likely going to have to clean it up, but we will earmark a certain amount of money to then clean up the site. Anything over that, we're not going to deal with, and we're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that we don't have to, that we only have to invest only so much.
So are you saying they are predicting that, excuse my French, shit's gonna go wrong and they're just gonna pay for it? Is that what you're essentially saying? Like they just have money set aside to pay for the catastrophe that's gonna go wrong, or that they're gonna create, I should say.
That's precisely what I'm saying.
Okay.
That's precisely what I'm saying. It's and so all that, going back to Cameron's point about the impact, and so part of why the full impact isn't recognized or isn't acknowledged is because of the response. The response is already tailored to look a particular way, and only so much investment is going to be made in acknowledging what's transpired. So the impact has been tremendous. Well, one, in what Ruby, Jose, and I chronicle in our essay is that it took 3 years for Talavast residents to find out from Lockheed or from Lockheed's environmental consultants that there was a toxic plume, encircling the community.
And that was on accident, right? They found out.
They found out on that precise. Yeah, they found out on accident because Lockheed's environmental consultants were trying to install monitoring wells throughout the community, because they were trying to figure out how far and wide the toxic plume extended from the ABC site, and they were attempting to install one of the monitoring wells on the property of Mrs. Laura Ward, Dr. and Mrs. Ward, and she approached the guy running operating the bulldozer, trying to install this monitoring well on her property, and said, "Hey, why is your bulldozer on my property?" And he said, "Oh, you may want to check with." I forget which office he may have actually referred her to, but he basically said there's an issue with contamination from. He probably didn't identify ABC as being the source of the contamination, but I think he said that
you don't know, but the water is contaminated here. That's the quote in the piece. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know how wild that has to be? Like, you are just minding your own business. And you come home, you come out of there are people drilling in your yard. And like the more that I thought about this, I was like, we hear about this community who was already not told what was going on, who even when these reports were coming out, it talked about how the facility workers in the front office or on the line, which typically would not have been Black folks, how they were at slight risk, but they never actually sat there and looked at the work that custodial staff that was primarily Black was doing, who were being the most exposed. None of that was in their initial reports. And yet now you just have somebody drilling in your front yard and they're like, oh yeah, well, nobody told y'all the water contaminated. I'm here to test how much.
For 40 years.
That for me, I sat here like livid. just completely pissed off. And I cannot imagine having to be a community member. And I think about the way that my aunties all talk and my mama talk and my uncles. And so to think that like you find this out, the way in which folks have probably went into a complete panic, because once one person know, that probably wasn't the only yard somebody was digging in. That's not the first person who was coughing and might have been sick in that community. And you know, to then be thinking like people have probably been questioning for a while. Why are people getting sick? What happened? What's going on over there at that plant? What are they doing? You know, so and so got sick down the road. We've been trying to bring them stuff, and now somebody finally gives you answers after y'all have been trying to figure it out for so long. And even as a Black woman, like I say y'all because I think like this made me feel like these are my aunties, my uncles, my community members. I instantly thought back to Chicago with Miss Cheryl Johnson, who was freaking out because she was like, why everybody in South Side of Chicago is getting asthma? Why are so many people dealing with lung cancer in my community and no one is telling us why? To find out something very similar was taking place. Also questioning why there's no trees built in my community and how that also is leading to it. And so to then have, you know, thinking of this and how once again we're seeing that so many people, so many different white agencies were aware of what was happening and not actually informing the very community members who have to live here and work here and clean up the very mess that the EPA was saying was toxic. And and when I envisioned this, I was like, that person probably said it so nonchalantly. I was like, was there any empathy even in there? And if I could have spoken to that person personally, I would have asked, did he even have any empathy when he spoke to you? And just was like, water's contaminated. You know?
And in this story, relative to everybody else, he's the good guy. That's how bad it is. Like relative.
That's somebody who told you.
Yeah, because at least you got the information, regardless of how. Once they learn about that, there's a series of events that sets off. There was a lot of stuff, but I don't want to tell the whole story. So I know that one about the lady who showed up and said the people were unkept. That one really pissed me off. But I'm gonna let one of y'all explain that. Like what the residents responded once they heard this, though, right? They didn't just lay down. Like they did respond to this once they heard it, right?
Yeah, you want to talk about Miss Brooks, Ruby? Or you?
Yes, I can talk about Kimberly Brooks. So we came across the email she wrote regarding her visit to Talavast.
And who is Kimberly Brooks?
Kimberly Brooks was the woman who was sent to Talavast to figure out if there were private wells in the community. And she worked for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, I believe, as an environmental specialist. And so her superior sent her to Talavast, and he wanted her to figure out if there were wells in the community, because at this point, the FDP knew that the groundwater had been contaminated, but they still had not informed the community. And so it was a really simple question, are there wells? But Kimberly Brooks, as you mentioned, was too scared to get out of her car to try to see if there were actually wells in the community. She said that Talavast was unkempt and that there were dogs, and she apparently really didn't like dogs. But anyway, so in her email, she, I believe, identifies 2 probable wells in the community, and a Talavast resident actually told her that everyone on one street in the community uses wells. But even with that evidence of there being wells in the community, which would have constituted the primary route of exposure to TCE and the other organic solvents that were in the groundwater, to our knowledge, the FDP did not send anyone else to verify Kimberly Brooks's findings until after the community and the local media was made aware of what had happened in Talavast and forced the FDP to actually take action and figure out something they could have figured out if they had just spoken to someone in Talavast and took what they'd said seriously.
And they already had records of these things anyway. If I'm correct, they had records that proved that there was that the land was poisoned. And didn't the residents have to create they had like kind of their own organization, and they basically hire a private firm or someone to do their own assessment? And what did they find? Because I remember they found they found things that confirmed what we already know, right?
Well, the community organization Focus, they hired their own public health
Yeah.
uh, expert, I guess you would call him. He's a professor. He was teaching at Florida International University at the time. He conducted the health study.
It was
But
called the group was called Focus, a local advocacy
yeah,
group. Yeah.
Focus, yeah, family oriented community united strong is what the acronym stands for.
Right. Okay.
And Focus had actually been in existence, had been organized years before the discovery of the contamination. It came together, I think, originally around really just trying to undertaking a project called Reimagining Talavast. And I think that effort came about because the county, Manatee County, was trying to authorize the building of another facility in Talavast, I think connected to the Salvation Army, or maybe it's another organization. And the residents had other plans for what they wanted, continue to want Talavast, to look like. And so they had this entire campaign for themselves called Imagining Talavast. And just as that is about to take off, this is when there's this discovery, well, from the community's perspective, discovery of the contamination. And so Focus was around before the contamination, but it was sort of put into this role of representing the community to try and get some type of restitution for what happened, and that has involved mostly a lot of legal cases, a lot of lawsuits that they brought before, or lawsuits against Lockheed Martin, lawsuits against the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, trying to chart the best way forward for protecting Talavast.
So it says in your piece, I think I might have misstated this a little bit, but so when they did the study, to your point, to even garner these lawsuits, it says in the final 2 months of 2010, this is the group that Focus had hired. When environmental consultants measured beryllium dust around ABC site at 250 times acceptable levels, a team of public health researchers led by Janvier Gassana, then an associate professor of Florida International University, Robert Sturple of College of Public Health and Social Work, surveyed almost 70% of Talavast residents about their health and acquired medical records of over 150 residents from their databases. And it said they confirmed that there were 78 cases of diagnosing current or former Talavast residents from 1962 to 2010, concluding that the overall cancer incidence among Talavast residents was 85% higher than among the Florida African Americans. So 85% higher in Talavast than the general black population, which tends to have a higher cancer rate anyway. So that's, yeah. And then it said cancers were positively associated with drinking well water among people who never used filtration and were born in Talavast after 1962. But then later on, I believe the state tries to say we can't correlate because of addresses. We can't, or some BS like that. We can't correlate. That's why they died, or something of that nature.
Right. So there were 2 or 3 health studies done by state agencies, by Florida state agencies, 2 by ATDSR. I think that's the Agency for Toxic, like I
I think
said.
it's the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry.
That's it. Thank you, Ruby. ATSDR, yes. They conducted their own health studies, but what they did, they went to Florida databases and then took numbers from Florida databases and then ran numbers to try and determine a correlation between rates of cancer and the and the contamination. And that's why they said, oh, well, we can't directly connect some of these cases of cancer with the proper zip code, so we don't necessarily know whether the numbers that we're getting are from people who actually physically lived in Talavast. So, but that was their method of just looking at numbers that had been collected by their own agency.
Right.
Dr. Gasana and his team did, they actually met with, interviewed residents from Talavast. They sat down with them and took surveys where they asked them detailed questions about their health. That's the difference in the methodologies of the study that Dr. Gasana did versus what the Florida state agencies did. And the Florida state agencies have not responded to, rather the Florida Department of Health, Florida Department of Environmental Protection have not responded directly to Dr. Gasana's study.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me, that there were so many studies that had been taking place that the residents weren't even made aware of beforehand. And then once people are actually doing the work, people are still just choosing to be no better than that lady who doesn't deserve to be named twice, who wouldn't even get out of her car. Like, how you're here to conduct research and you won't even get out of the car. Talking about there's dogs outside. I don't know a community yet across the world, and I have been blessed enough to visit quite a few countries where I've not seen a dog.
Right.
Anywhere. They are beloved all over the world.
Yeah, it's pretty
and you're
universal.
like, I saw dogs outside.
Yeah,
Like,
I think you said in the piece there was a lot of racially coded language, and that's what that was, you know.
It said that in your piece, you even wrote like Talavast Black residents and the homes in which they live were not deemed even worth the effort to fulfill the agency's mission to protect the public. And it's like not worth the effort, and yet folks are, there's cancer spreading. There are incredibly high rates of miscarriages, sterility, neurological disorders happening all over the place. And local residents were not made aware of this. That is disgusting, and it's not, and the unfortunate aspect of this is like, this isn't something that is just isolated to
No, I mean, with Flint, they had to go do similar things. They had to hire the residents had to hire some type of private firm to test their water and to confirm that. You know, we know about the city manager in Flint that the state took over and switched their water off to, you know, to the poisonous part when it wasn't initially hooked to that to try to save money. So you see the similar abuses. It's not the exact same story, but you see similar abuses there. Sorry to cut you off. I was just making that connection, but.
No, I even think of this notion of like how folks not only don't tell people but then they make a racist assumption that folks wouldn't even have understood what was going on. Like bringing back to the similar story that I talked about earlier in Chicago with Cheryl Johnson, like when she was going and asking questions, they literally talk about how like, oh, folks would just be like, you're not a scientist, you're not going to understand. It's not that bad. We promise y'all, like, you know, you just are, you're asking a lot of questions, but like, trust me, we're the scientists over here. Like, we've done the research. We know what's really happening. Like, you know, other factors play a role in it because you're Black. And like, she talked about how like, she just would not allow that. And despite the fact that like, it was breaking her spirit, it continued to rally with her other community members, very similar to Flint, very similar to Oakland, very similar to what was taking place in Talavast until she got answers, until their community got answers, because it's not something that is acceptable to just continue to allow these things to take place.
So you said that earlier one of you had said that there's been court cases about this. I believe there was a law passed. So can you talk about like where things currently stand, and was there any recompense for what took place?
There have been a number of lawsuits filed from individual residents and from Focus regarding the so what happened. Lockheed Martin assumed responsibility for the cleanup, the remediation of the contamination in Talavast, and so Focus has filed a number of Focus and individual residents have filed lawsuits regarding Lockheed's remediation plans to make sure that it's feasible, that it can actually work. And so there were a number of cases challenging Lockheed's plan, challenging FDP's approval of Lockheed's plans. There are a lot of cases around that. There were some cases, rather one big case that was on behalf of Mrs. Laura Ward, who's the co-executive director of Focus, regarding the emotional distress and physical, impact of the contamination on residents. So it was filed by Mrs. Ward on behalf of the community.
It says 200 included over 200 residents. That's what,
right.
it is.
That's right. That's the one, and that was settled for an undisclosed amount. And this is a part of the problem. And so the amount was undisclosed, and then the 200 residents who received money as a result of the settlement had to sign a non-disclosure agreement.
Yeah.
I believe that's the kind of agreement it was. But basically, residents could not talk to each other about the amounts that they received. Has fostered some distrust within the community. They can't talk about what happened and why, and so that's and then there was the Talavast bill that we talk about in the article, which was a bill that now requires FDP to tell communities, once FDP finds out that a community has been that they're facing contamination of some sort, the FDP is required to notify those communities, I guess, within 30 days.
So they weren't required to do that beforehand?
Oh no, they weren't required before, which is how they were able to take 3 years, not even take 3 years, which is why it took 3 years for Talavast residents to find out on a whim. It wasn't even, I mean, if Mrs. Ford hadn't asked, hey, why are you digging on my land? Who knows how much longer it would have taken for Talavast residents to find out. FDP was not required to tell communities that their properties have been contaminated. Only since, was it 2007, I think, is when that bill passed. So that's what's happened on the legal end. What's going on now is that there are new industries that are encircling the community. There are warehouses, commercial parks that are being built around Talavast, and even as the groundwater is being remediated. So there's this building, this construction going on, and it's not clear how that construction is affecting the remediation process.
Yeah, so this is ongoing.
This is ongoing, yeah. It's not stopping.
I
Yeah.
think we had talked off air about the interview he did with Dr. Ball on a Mix What I Like on Black Power Media, which we're a part of as well. And I know you talked about a little bit more about Lockheed Martin and their role in all of this and just the military industrial complex. But if I'm correct, Lockheed Martin has a pretty good foothold in Florida in general, right? This isn't just a random off brand facility. They have pretty major influence in the whole state. I mean, obviously they have influence beyond the state, but just since this is the story, they do have a large influence in the state, right?
Yes, they do. It's one of, if not the top, um, industrial employers or employers of engineers in the state of Florida. And there's actually another Black community in Orlando. I believe I'll probably get the name wrong, but I believe it's called Orange Park, right in Orlando, which is where Lockheed's major facility is located, or at least its major facility in Florida is located. And this Black community has recently, as in I believe January, has filed a lawsuit against Lockheed for contaminating their land.
Like you were talking about earlier, how they buy influence, or not? They not well. That I'll get to that. They know that this is gonna happen. Like this is predetermined. And I think there was I can't remember the name of the car. It was in the 70s. I don't know if it was a Pinto. I can't remember the name of the car. It was a car in the 70s that Ford decided was defective, and they knew this, and they put it out on the market anyway because they had deemed that it was less expensive to pay for settlements than it would be to recall the car. Like I wish I could remember the name of this. I remember reading this story specifically. I'll link it once we put it out, and I'll probably, when I edit it, I'll put it on the screen. But they knew that it would be cheaper to do it that way. So I think in some ways it's similar in this case. It would be more expensive to be environmentally safe at the beginning, at the front end, than to pay for whatever back end settlement or lawsuit or whatever. Like this is actually like built in or baked into the pie, as they say. So, and I think that's the thing, is environmental racism is actually seen as it is part of the business model. You know, like it's actually part of the business model. It's not this isn't something that just happens accidentally. Like this is actually how capitalism in general tends to function. Is it sees these things as part of what's going to happen, and this is just the game we play. And maybe there'll be a little bit of ruckus, but they're not going to be able to stop us. And Lockheed Martin, who is engaged in, some of the worst atrocities because they sell weapons across the world and engage in war. So you have a direct connection between war and then what happens in the local community. So I just think that's the part I think sometimes we miss. This isn't just something that just happens haphazardly. Every once in a while, yeah, mistakes get made and things happen. And people just try to cover their tracks. But based on what you're saying, it sounds like this was premeditated in a way. Not maybe literally in a sense, like they didn't say we're going to literally give people cancer. It wasn't that simple, but in a more complicated way, it was premeditated because it's understood that this might happen. And then it's just like, so be it.
Yeah, because it's a poor Black community. Like
yeah.
They're not doing this in Beverly Hills. They're not doing this in Austin. They're doing this in small places.
That's right. I mean, in Talavast's case, what I was suggesting is that, not suggesting, what I would argue certainly is that when Lockheed decides to purchase associated or like affiliated companies, like they decided to purchase Loral Corporation, which is still in existence in a different sort of form now. I think it's mostly focused on like satellites. But when it decided to purchase Laurel, I'm saying that they looked at Laurel's holdings and did an audit of its own sort,
Mm-hmm.
and made calculations about, okay, if something might pop off in this area, this may be contaminated, because
Mm-hmm.
the dangers of beryllium, its effects on human beings has been known since at least the 1940s.
Right.
So I'm saying that they sat down and said, okay, in this site that we're going to assume responsibility for, this might happen. So let's go ahead and keep that in mind. This site, this might
Right.
happen. Let's go ahead and keep it. Right. I'm saying it becomes a part of the calculus. You don't become a multi-billion-dollar corporation without making those kinds of
Yeah.
calculations. It just doesn't.
It's
just doesn't
called
happen.
it's called risk assessment. You know,
That's
that's the business term for it, risk assessment. So, but no, I was just saying, like, that's just it's risk assessment. I did look it up. I was correct. It was Ford Pinto, 1970.
Oh,
Yeah, it was Ford Pinto. I was talking about the defective
cool.
cars. Yeah, Pinto, I believe they don't make those anymore. Sure Ruby doesn't even know what we're talking about, but like, but you don't want to drive a Pinto anyway. It's not a good look. But but yeah, it was Ford Pinto, and they actually knew that it had bursting gas tanks. It was going to cause collisions, but you know it was so yeah, it's just normal. Like, I mean, it is important to note that Lockheed Martin wasn't, like you said, the owner of this company throughout its entire time. ABC did own it, but like you said, they had worked with ABC before they bought it, right? So this isn't like they just flew in and this was like a new thing. They kind of had some idea of what had been going on. And I think our other thing is how these type of companies, they shield themselves by letting these other companies do some of the dirty work, and then you know they can kind of come in and clean it up, quote unquote, you know. But they know the business and they know how this works. Like this, they have all the top people, you know, the lawyers, the execs. They know what's going on. Yeah.
It's like, oh, my little brother gets into this mess all the time. Let me go fix this for him. Like,
Yeah.
I've done it before, I'll do it again. And that's the way we've seen these corporations protect themselves time and time again. But my question is more so like, how can Black communities then protect themselves from these things, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the things that made Talavast a vulnerable community to this type of neglect, and how can other Black communities fight to become aware of the damage that may be happening in their own communities and their environment?
So Ruby may not know much about Pintos or anything about Pintos, but Ruby, believe it or not, has been doing work in environmental justice for a long time, since high school, and from Houston. I'd be curious, if you don't mind, Ruby, maybe like what kinds of things have you seen that make communities more vulnerable, but then also like effective ways of contesting, you know, the kinds of things that have happened, you know, in Talavast.
Well, I think what made Talavast vulnerable was, first, that it's a Black community. It's also a small community, and it's an unincorporated community, which means that it does not have any representation in local government, which I think has made it especially vulnerable to intentional government neglect. And in terms of ways in which Talavast and communities like it can mobilize in order to effectively try to fight against all of these corporations and governments who have poisoned their communities, I think it's clear that in the vast majority of cases, people will not be forthcoming with information. And so I think that Black communities will have to mobilize, and I feel like collective action organizations like Focus are an effective way in order to make people's voices heard. And I know that in the case of Talavast, I think people started to pay more attention when local news outlets picked up on the story, which is unfortunate because people should have been listening to Talavast residents themselves. But I believe that the publicity was what in the end galvanized the FTP to actually take action. And so I feel like if communities were to utilize that avenue, then that could lead to change as well.
Yeah, I can't say enough about, about media as a tool, which is why we're so grateful that you're having us on your show and giving us the opportunity to to talk about Talavast, to talk about the essay that we wrote. I mean, media is important because corporations don't want bad press. They don't want to be looked at in a negative light.
Right.
One of the things that Lockheed did, and I don't remember whether we mentioned this in the article or not, but around the time that Talavast's story was being told consistently in local newspapers, Lockheed started its own kind of local campaign in schools. It would go to schools and give out T-shirts and pins and claim that it was recruiting young people to work for recruiting and trying to inspire young people to get their training in the sciences, math and sciences, so that they can one day come and work, for Lockheed. And so corporations like Lockheed are very uh, they realize the power of the public and being in the public eye and being seen in a negative light. And so I think that the more that there are media outlets like this that can create uh, platforms for communities to give updates, to talk about and to chronicle cases like this, to bust myths,
Yeah.
is just paramount. In addition to the organizing that Ruby mentioned, and organizing, I think a part of organizing is having access to media to be able to tell stories, but then being aware of land use policies,
Mm-hmm.
keeping track of how local governments are rezoning areas in communities for particular uses. That's a paramount importance.
Yeah, I think that goes just to organization. Like we say all the time, join an organization, be part of an organization, work with an organization, because you know that it was an organization that even got this far, despite how horrible this story is. Like you talk about focus, they're the ones that had to galvanize to get
Right.
an actual serious assessment of what went down, because the state wasn't going to do it. Or they did it, but they weren't going to share it, I should say. So they had to do it themselves, and they had the most thorough assessment, by far. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's not just an individual that can do it. And then something else you said, and then we can close. But I think this is slightly out of the purview, but I think it still connects. We talked about Lockheed Martin recruiting students, and I think we should be careful with these new like diversity initiatives that
Yeah,
are
for sure.
happening, because this is the type of downfall that you can see from some of these. Like, they're recruiting people to buy influence in communities so they can do terrible things like this. It seems on the front end that, oh, more black people, more people of color, more so-called minorities, whatever they were called on the particular day, are being hired to work at these places. But a lot of times they're just buying influence, and then they can send that person into your community, and you have a black face telling you that you don't have poison water, you
Yeah.
know, and
That's
and
exactly.
that and that's dangerous. So I think we also should be careful about that interlink of corporations trying to buy influence and telling you that they're giving you opportunity, or they're fighting structural racism, or whatever their equity statement said after last summer. I think we should just be careful of of that type of dynamic, especially moving forward, because I think more and more corporations, even more than they previously were, are starting to become hip to that knowledge, and they're adjusting. So we need to adjust as well.
Yeah. It's significant and so important to just question everything. Asking questions will get you an answer, and asking questions to the people in your community, asking your elders, asking Google, and I think a lot of people say, just Google it as this end all be all kind of passive thing to tell people when you don't want to explain it to them. But it is a tool. And I think a lot of times we wouldn't have found out about things like this without not only just asking the people around us in our community for backstory, but by doing our individual research in order to see, is this happening elsewhere? And I think that's something that has been a blessing of social media, of media in general, of the internet as a whole, is that stories like this of what's happened in Talavast wasn't just contained there. It wasn't a community whose struggle, whose pain, whose loss was left there, but the word has thankfully been able to get out. And it has probably sparked, I can only imagine, people in other communities now questioning the same very things. Wow, like this isn't just a Florida issue. This isn't just a Flint issue. This isn't just happening in isolated things, but we see this does happen in Talavast. This is happening in other places in Florida. It's happened in Oakland. It's happened in Flint. It's happened in the south side of Chicago. It's happened in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, in LA. And we're seeing the way that this is weaving together. And we're seeing who's at the core of it and at the root of it. So that way our next steps are then how do we just continue to mobilize to dismantle these very systems who are not aimed to keep us safe. And if others aren't going to keep us safe as a community, it's our responsibility to keep each other safe. So thank you both for being here, for informing us, for informing me. I was not aware of this before we began to prepare for this. And so I just want to say thank you to you both and everyone who worked with you on this.
Thank you both so much for having us. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe and to stay out the way.